Hey everybody, it's Mike from AMZ Advisors, and today I'm excited to be interviewing Robert from FreightRight. Robert's going to be talking to us about how the coronavirus has impacted supply chains across the world. And his company, FreightRight, specializes in freight forwarding for Amazon and e-commerce companies, and they do over 50% of their business specifically in Amazon and e-commerce. So Robert, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I'm Robert Chatrian. I'm the founder and COO of FreightRight. And like you said, we specialize in e-commerce and Amazon logistics. That's around 65% of our business actually either ends up at Amazon or in e-commerce fulfillment of some sort. Started the company 13 years ago out of my apartment with a credit card. So frugality and being lean is kind of part of our DNA. So we're very careful with money, both ours and our customers. And that's how we're able to provide great customer service, but at reasonable prices. So that's a little about me and the company.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing with us. And I mean, just to kind of get your perspective on what you're seeing and what's kind of happening, how have you seen coronavirus affecting supply chain and international freight?
Uh, the Chinese New Year this year was early in January, and everybody was kind of getting ready for a slow month and a slow beginning of the year anyway. But then that coincided with the coronavirus, and the Chinese New Year holiday was pretty much extended and then turned into a full shutdown for basically 2 months, right? And everybody expected a slump, and all the carriers they already, for Chinese New Year, they basically take out a bunch of vessels out of rotation. And with the coronavirus and the expectation of slump, they kind of went overboard with it and basically took out too many vessels out of rotation, expecting the slump. What I think nobody expected was how fast it would get back and how fast production would ramp up. So what ended up happening is too many bookings and not enough vessels. Now it's been happening about a month now. One of the main carriers on the Trans-Pacific lane, PIL, also completely permanently pulled out. They stopped servicing basically China to North America lane. So that sort of put a lot more pressure on the capacity, because it was a major carrier. And of course, with all the PPE shipments, basically with all the flights canceled, a lot of that started flowing into ocean freight, putting even more pressure on capacity because that's obviously prioritized over everything else. Those are all pretty much at some level government contracts, and very high paying customers. So carriers basically prioritize that. Certainly happening in at least Shanghai and Ningbo more than anywhere else. So that's why you're seeing a huge overbooking problem right now with ocean carriers.
Okay, so the issues have impacted not only ocean freight, but it's also had a significant impact on air freight.
Yeah, so air freight, primarily hit because of all the passenger flight cancellations. Most of the commercial cargo actually ships on passenger flights, in the belly of those flights. So a smaller proportion actually ships on all cargo aircraft. With the shutdowns and all the flights canceled, most of the cargo couldn't fly. So that's essentially what caused the whole problem. And then added to that, all the mask and gown and personal protective equipment shipments, sanitizers and such, those were all sent by air freight, because of the urgency. And so that kind of bumped everything else off the flights. And for several months now, pretty much everything that ships by air freight is just PPE, because there's just no competing with that product. You see price of N95 masks went from basically being $1 a year ago to $5, $6, $7 now, and we've seen flight prices, of a charter aircraft go from $200,000 to $2 million.
Oh.
So that's basically what everybody's ready to pay to get their masks delivered, right? And if you're shipping anything else, how do you compete with that? How do you get the space? Basically, air freight was pretty much not even an option for almost anything else. And all the freight that would have gone by air freight, that too basically started flowing into ocean freight. And now we're seeing even masks and other PPE products basically flock to the ports.
Wow.
Just because there's just not enough flights.
So is all of this causing additional challenges and issues in the U.S., either with shipping product here or receiving it?
Yeah, so air freight is definitely very challenging. We see now it's starting to ease up a little bit, but in the last 2 months we've seen almost no other commodities imported by air freight. So there's also challenges with capacity. At the ground terminals, at airports. Again, it's starting to ease up a little bit now, but the last 2 months you have very limited resources everywhere. Airline terminals basically staggering their shifts, working at with half the staff. Everybody except warehouse workers working from home, obviously affecting productivity. We've seen a little bit of delays with customs, not so much the processing, because the vast majority of shipments are cleared electronically and automatically, but every time you have a shipment that does require a manual review by a customs officer, those tend to take a little longer, and that's basically what's causing the issues. With ports, you have a different problem because of the large number of empty containers and empty chassis sitting at the ports because of the slump and basically no imports in January and February. A lot of the empty containers didn't ship back and weren't picked up by U.S. companies to be loaded for export. So you have now a huge accumulation of empty equipment, which is affecting the space at the ports. So you pick up a full container, you can't return the empty because they just don't want to take it, or chassis. They don't have space to store chassis. So that's another sort of indirect problem of the shutdown in China.
Okay. And you mentioned a little bit about how the costs of air freight have increased dramatically, but has all of this affected the cost of all shipping and freight forwarding across the board?
It's an interesting question. The rates overall have definitely gone up, but what an indirect result of this crisis is that a lot of companies, a lot of logistics companies are in an existential struggle right now. So you see giants like Kuehne Nagel. It's probably the largest forwarder in the world, is laying off 20,000 people. You have TQL laying off 1,000 people or so, and a lot of freight forwarders that operate on specifically the Trans-Pacific trade lane. Chinese forwarders, American forwarders that specialize in China, they've seen a huge hit. So they're struggling to survive and basically dropping their rates. So you'll see a lot of freight forwarders minimize their profits just to keep the volume coming, which should basically mitigate the rate increases a little bit. But definitely there is an increase overall. Air freight, again, we're talking until about a week ago, the rates were maybe 5-6 times as high as they were, say, in November, which is actually like peak season for air freight. If you can compare it to even earlier, I mean, they're maybe 8 times higher. And it's not even about the price anymore. We tell our customers, if you want to ship by air freight, you basically have to have an open budget. You only ship by air freight things that are a necessity.
Yeah.
You absolutely have to have them, and price is not an object. Ocean freight too has increased. I mean, we're looking at starting first week of June, probably rates of over $2,000 a container from China-based ports to U.S. West Coast. That's a level we haven't seen in a long time. It's been a couple of years, but that's basically a result of the capacity crunch. And ocean carriers are like they're like OPEC. They when the rates are dropping, they cut capacity to basically increase the rates, and they've been trying to do that for a few years, and now it looks like they may have overdone it because we're seeing some freight forwarders roll as many as 60% of their bookings because it's just vessels are overbooked by 60%.
Okay. And how are all these issues and challenges affecting the brands and retailers that are actually importing these products from China or from Asia?
It's very interesting because it's sort of category specific. We talked a lot about this and saw a lot on the news about Amazon and Target and Walmart basically prioritizing certain categories. Amazon basically stopped receiving everything non-essential for a while. So if you happened to be selling soap and sanitizer wipes, obviously huge explosion of business. Garments are on the other end of the spectrum, struggling because people didn't go out, people didn't shop. We have the back to school season coming up, and nobody's sure if they're going to go back to school. So if you're selling backpacks, it's very tough right now. If you're selling kids clothing, it's very tough right now. But if you look at the numbers that Amazon, Walmart, and Target are reporting for their quarterly financials, they're all doing really, really well. So it really depends on which stores you're in as a merchant. There's one of the reasons that Target and Walmart did so well is because they stayed open, because they happened to sell essential products. They stayed open, and while people were there, they bought everything else that was not essential because they had no other choice. They couldn't go to other stores to buy non-essentials because those stores were closed. So it's a little bit of a artificial sort of reason and just an indirect benefit to the stores. So if you were in those stores, you probably did really well. If you're selling some interesting categories, like backyard toys or school supplies that kids needed at home, you probably did really well. If you think about the back to school categories and then just school supply categories, and this is one of the reasons Amazon keeps changing their their policies about receiving these categories, is because it's very hard to tell, and even data analysis doesn't necessarily show you the right results. If you think about it, both backpacks and, let's say, pens and pencils are in the same category, right? They're school supplies, but because schools are closed, backpacks aren't selling. But because people are now largely homeschooling their kids, they're still buying a lot of things that they would buy if the kids were going to school. In fact, they're buying things that they wouldn't buy if the kids were going to school. Like, think of all the whiteboards and blackboards that have been purchased in the last 2 months. Those who would have expected that, right? And they fall in the same category. So if you're Amazon, how do you allow sellers to basically stock those items at FBA and not stock products that are not going to sell just because they're in the same category? That's why you're seeing them lift restrictions but limit the quantities they would allow.
Okay.
Definitely very, very interesting change happening.
Yeah, and it sounds like it must be a challenge for a lot of the retailers and brands to keep up with all this. So have you seen your clients that are on the retail side adjust in certain ways to all the changes going on?
Yeah, so there's definitely interesting trends happening. We actually have customers who have manufacturing facilities on the East Coast, but because the East Coast was shut down a little more so than the West Coast, and because of the backlog in production and orders, they basically started shipping to the West Coast from China. Or companies that ship to East Coast started shipping to the West Coast just to get ahead by a couple of weeks. So there's definitely a shift there from the East Coast to the West Coast. There's a shift from companies that have actually manufacturing in United States to start sourcing products overseas just because of the shutdowns. Another huge factor is the fact that people aren't getting back to work. A lot of factories are having trouble getting their employees back to work. I regularly speak to companies that keep postponing their back to work deadlines just because of the uncertainty. And today, you have a couple of counties in California that were opened up and are shutting back down. So I think it's still a very much a fluid situation and changing almost every week.
Okay.
So a lot of changes and very hard to plan for them.
Okay. So how is your company FreightRight and yourself and your team helping your clients adjust to these changes?
I mean, it's definitely a lot more involved. So the same shipment requires a lot more communication, a lot more planning. So we spend a lot more time on every shipment now than we used to, because of constantly changing basically paradigms. So we've definitely changed how we communicate, how often we communicate, dialed back a little bit on automatic notifications to customers and more towards custom, basically, solutions of constant communication. Doing a lot more meetings with the stakeholders, just to keep them informed of their supply chains. So it's become a lot more manual, and then we've done some things to help our customers in the last few months, to cope with the Amazon restrictions. Like I said, a lot of our business is Amazon freight, and a lot of our customers were unable to deliver to Amazon. A lot of our customers were unable to generate labels and FBA replenishment orders because of the restrictions. So instead of letting their products sit in China, what we started doing is shipping everything to US and just holding it in US warehouses. This way, when Amazon lifted the restrictions, they were a few weeks ahead of their competitors because they had product here ready to be labeled and delivered to Amazon within a day's notice versus shipping it all the way from China. And we still have a lot of freight from our customers in our warehouses. They're still shipping to our warehouses even though Amazon lifted a lot of the restrictions. Just because they want to avoid the uncertainty, they want to avoid more shutdowns in China or any other disruptions to the supply chain. But also because Amazon largely restricts the quantities you can send to FBA. So a lot of our customers that would otherwise ship containers to Amazon ship those containers to our warehouses, and then we basically drip feed them a few pallets at a time into the FBA network. We've also ramped up our consolidations for Amazon. Freightrite has several consolidations a week, basically for smaller shipments going direct to Amazon. So these bypass U.S. container freight stations, U.S. warehouses. The whole work is done in China. Product is labeled and loaded in the containers in China, and that's basically delivered straight to Amazon facilities here. That's helped a lot with some of the customers who are scaling back on volumes. It's a very economical way of shipping to Amazon if you don't have a full container. So a combination of those basically has done quite a bit of mitigating of the challenges for our customers.
Okay, awesome. And I just have one final question that came to my mind after hearing you speak a little bit more. You mentioned that some of the restrictions and the issues are starting to ease a little bit. What do you think that e-commerce and Amazon sellers can expect in the coming months? Do you think things are going to return to normal, or are we still going to see some continuing lingering issues in the supply chain and logistics?
I don't think we're going back to normal anytime soon, if ever. I think a lot of the things are basically going to change permanently. Definitely in some product categories, you'll have permanent changes. As far as Amazon goes and the restrictions, it's been a very interesting progression from, in the beginning, them saying, hey, we're going to only receive essential products. And then basically saying, okay, we're going to receive essential products, but we're adding categories that we now consider essential. Because if you think about it, everybody would think sanitizers, wipes and soap and paper towel would be essential. But then, 3 weeks into the shutdown, if you have kids, you're going nuts, and all of a sudden, an inflatable pool is now becoming essential, right? So that's been changing consistently. In the beginning, it was backyard toys. Then everybody realized, hey, we need board games and puzzles, and those are essential. So now everybody's trying to get puzzles, to occupy their kids' time. Then, all the people staying home, they started cleaning their houses and remodeling their houses and fixing their garages, and now they're buying shelves and stuff like that. Like, you see a lot of people everywhere you go on bicycles. These people didn't have bicycles 3 months ago. So all of a sudden, they're out and about, they're exercising, they're running. So exercise equipment is probably doing really well. And these things are going to have a lasting effect. If a significant portion of the U.S. population started exercising, that's a miracle, right? Yeah. And it's going to continue. It's a lifestyle change. So that's going to have an effect on the category, for the future. So there's a lot of these things happening. Some of them are obvious. Some of them are not obvious at all. Some of them are very counterintuitive. But these changes are here to stay. And the way Amazon and all the large retailers look at product categories is going to change permanently. Social distancing is probably now interwoven into our culture, forever, to a certain extent. Yes, we'll go back to, maybe 4 feet instead of 6 feet of distance between people, but it's going to change how we behave and what we buy and how we consume things. So that's, I think, is a very important thing to think about when you're planning for the future. If you're trading goods.
All right, thank you for that. And do you have any last words of advice that any sellers or e-commerce brands can take advantage of now to help minimize issues?
Um, it looks like rates are going up, and they're going to be on an upward trajectory. So um, there's warehousing space right now in US, plenty of it. After 2 years of battery of the trade war. So take advantage of the warehouse space and take advantage of the lower rates. Um, don't ship as soon as possible. I don't think the rates are going to get any better, and the warehouse space is probably going to start filling up. So make your arrangements with warehouses now and start shipping as soon as possible. Is probably what I would advise.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Robert. Just a last thing. If any of our audience wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach you and FreightRight?
Yeah, so freightright.com is the website. There are links there to get a hold of experts. From our Amazon team, from our import or export teams or project cargo, whatever they have. There's an expert for that. They can get a hold of us through the website. Email us at info@freightright.com, or call us at 877-909-7447.
Awesome. All right. Thank you again so much, Robert. I really appreciate your insight into this, and I think our audience will as well. It was great speaking with you, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, Mike.
All right. Thank you, Robert.
All right.